The wooden follower of my late husband Harlan's Dutch cheese press was off balance by exactly 11 ounces. That is the detail that saved my life, the weight of a hollow core no one else would have noticed. When I pried off the maple cap that night, in the dark of the milking parlor with goats shuffling outside, I found a cavity lined with wax paper, and inside that cavity sat the original notarized partnership agreement my niece Betrayal swore she had never signed, along with a note in Harlan's handwriting that said, "Do not trust them. Save yourself." That was the moment I knew the $590,000 sale of Bell Meadow Dairy would come apart board by board, and that Betrayal would end up scrubbing cheese molds in canvas coveralls that read "Cultured My Trust," with her fraud docket number printed on every label. What I did not know yet was how much of my own grief I would have to swallow to get there, and how many times I would have to let them believe I was broken while I counted the weight of every lie. My name is not important. What matters is that, for 27 years, I drew blood for a living as a hospital phlebotomist, third shift, the woman who finds a vein when everyone else has blown the easy ones, and the patient is crying and the surgeon is pacing. I learned to read people by the way their veins rolled under my fingers, hard and sclerotic from years of alcohol, thin and fragile from chemo, tiny and terrified in a child. I could tell you a patient's blood pressure from the bounce of a vein before the cuff ever went on. I could feel a rolling vein slip under my needle if I did not anchor it with the exact right stretch of skin. That skill, that patience, that willingness to sit in the dark with a difficult problem, is what saved me when my own family tried to bleed me dry. At 56, I cashed out $119,000 of my pension to build an artisan goat dairy with my niece, Betrayal, because she had a way with Toggenburgs and a certain charm with the farmers' market crowd, and I had a way with numbers and a lifetime of discipline. We signed a notarized agreement giving me 55%, giving her 45%, and promising my church a lifetime of free cheese wheels for holiday baskets. Harlan, my quiet architect husband, built the cheese press, the aging room, and the milk house, and he carved that follower from a solid block of maple on the lathe he kept in the back of the barn. That follower was the only thing he ever kept locked in his shop, which I thought was odd at the time. But Harlan was particular about his tools, and I was particular about not asking too many questions about a man's private workshop. Harlan died on a Tuesday in October, an aortic aneurysm, the kind of thing that does not care how well you designed a roof or how carefully you sanded a piece of maple. The funeral was Thursday. By Thursday evening, Betrayal and her husband Cameron were in my kitchen with sympathy casseroles that tasted like grocery store deli counter and a black accordion folder full of papers they called estate documents. They were not there to mourn. I could see it in the way Cameron's eyes swept the room, pricing things, the way he looked at the kitchen windows like he was measuring them for resale value. Betrayal kept patting my hand and saying, "Auntie, you do not have to worry about a thing. We will handle all of it, the dairy, the house, the goats, everything." Her voice was soft and practiced, the voice of someone who had worked front of house at a winery and knew exactly how to soothe a difficult customer. Cameron stood near the door with his hands clasped in front of him, nodding along, his loafers without socks and his jaw tight. He mentioned 3 times that the dairy was not doing well, that the market for raw milk cheese had softened, that I was lucky to have family to step in before the bank came calling. I was in a fog, sleeping in Harlan's barn jacket, forgetting to eat, waking up at odd hours with the feeling that I had left a vein uncapped somewhere. The day after the funeral, Cameron pointed at the old Dutch cheese press in the corner of the milking parlor and said, "That thing is firewood. Junk. We will haul it off with the scrap metal." Betrayal wrinkled her nose and said the press was unsanitary, that no real buyer would want equipment that old, that she had a line on some modern stainless steel unit that would make the operation look professional. I watched him kick the press with the toe of his loafer. The sound of it, the dull thud of soft leather against old oak, made something in my chest go tight and hot. That press was not just a press. It was the last thing Harlan's hands had built from raw lumber. It had pressed every single wheel of cheese we ever sold. Later that night, after they left and I was alone in the dark with the sound of the goats shifting in the barn, I dragged the press into the workshop. I did it slowly, a few inches at a time, because the thing weighed over 200 pounds and my back is not what it was after decades of leaning over hospital beds. When I finally got it under the work light, I found the wooden follower, the flat disc that compresses curds. It was heavier than it should have been, and when I tapped it with a rubber mallet, the cap came loose. Inside, wrapped in waxed paper, was the original notarized agreement. Under it was a note in Harlan's handwriting. It said, "Do not trust them. Save yourself." The ink was black, the letters small and deliberate, the way he wrote measurements on building plans. I sat on the cold concrete floor and read that note 12 times until my eyes blurred and I had to put my head between my knees. The goats outside made the small sounds they make when they are settling for the night, and I thought about the 11 ounces, the hollow core, the fact that my husband had known something was wrong long before he died. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe family is not a free pass to steal your future. Now I am going to tell you exactly how I saved myself. The next morning, Betrayal came back with a stack of forms thick as a phone book. She called it a caregiver affidavit, durable power of attorney, temporary management authorization. She said it would let her pay the dairy's electric bill and keep the goat feed coming while I grieved. She put a pen in my hand and said, "Auntie, we love you. This is just paperwork." Her voice was soft and syrupy, the voice she used on customers who complained about the price of aged Chever. I looked at the top sheet long enough to see the words "full control of business assets." Then I let my hand shake. I let the pen hover over the page and drew a few aimless loops in the air. I told her I was too tired, too confused. The doctor had me on something for sleep. I said I would sign in a few days. She smiled the way you smile at a child who will not finish dinner, patient but annoyed. Cameron hovered behind her with his hands in his pockets, and I noticed a tiny muscle in his jaw twitching, the way a gambler twitches when the dice are in the air. They left with the folder, and I sat at the kitchen table for an hour, pressing my thumb into the wood grain, feeling the shape of the forged signature they would eventually try to make me write. I knew then I could not sign anything. I also knew I could not let them know I knew. The only way to beat a liar is to let the liar believe you are the weakest person in the room. 3 days later, they moved me into their house, a 5-bedroom colonial with a 3-car garage and a kitchen island the size of a cow stall. They said it was because I should not be alone, that the dairy would be too much for me, that they wanted to take care of me. They gave me the basement guest room, which had a deadbolt on the outside of the door. Cameron said it was for my own safety, in case I wandered at night, because grief can make people do strange things. I did not argue. I unpacked one suitcase and hid Harlan's note inside a box of tampons, because neither of them would ever open that box in 1,000 years. I kept the original agreement in the liner of my coat, folded flat against my ribs, which meant I wore the coat even inside the house, which meant they thought I was more broken than I was. I let them think that. I let Betrayal help me with my buttons. I let Cameron explain the remote control to me twice. I let myself be the helpless old auntie they were already treating me as, while inside my coat, against my left ribs, the raised notary seal pressed a small hard circle into my skin every time I breathed. That pressure was my anchor. It reminded me that I was not the foggy widow they saw. I was the woman who could find a vein in the dark, and I would find theirs eventually. For the first week, I was too heartbroken to pay attention, but old phlebotomist habits die hard. When you have spent 27 years watching for a missed vein or a faint pulse, you notice small things. Cameron started taking phone calls in the garage at 2 in the morning, his voice muffled but sharp. I could hear the cadence of a man trying to talk a creditor into another extension, the pause, the pitch, the little cough he made when he was lying. Betrayal stopped answering the dairy's cheese distributor and let the voicemail fill up. Then she changed the outgoing message to a generic tone that did not mention the business at all. The distributors stopped calling the landline, which was the first red flag, because in the 27 months we had been operating, that phone rang at least twice a day with orders. A cheese distributor does not just stop ordering unless someone has told them the cheese is gone. Then the spending started. Cameron bought a $94,000 King Ranch F350 with a custom trailer hitch and a bed liner that cost more than my first car. He parked it in the driveway at an angle so the neighbors could see the badge on the tailgate. Brielle booked a 10-day wine tour in Tuscany and left the brochure on the kitchen counter next to my grocery list, which I had written by hand because they never gave me the Wi-Fi password, and my phone barely got a signal in the basement. She told me the dairy was having its best quarter ever. She said it with a straight face while wearing a new pair of calfskin boots that probably cost $600, and I noticed the soles were still clean, no barn mud, no cheese brine, no straw. That meant she had not set foot on the dairy in weeks. One afternoon, I heard Cameron on the phone in his office, his voice low and tight. He said, "No, the notary stamp has to match the county seal. I told you, the one from 2016 is compromised." Then he saw me in the hallway and shut the door, not fast enough. That word, notary, stuck in my head like a needle in a sharps container. I had been a notary for the dairy's contracts. I knew what a raised seal looked like. I knew what a real embossed stamp felt like under a thumb, the little ridges of paper crushed into shape. And I knew, with a sudden cold certainty, that compromised meant forgery. That was the moment I started paying real attention. I stopped being a grieving widow drifting through their guest room and started being a phlebotomist again, which is to say, I started looking for the vein. And a phlebotomist knows that the needle has to go in at the right angle, with the right pressure, at the exact right moment. Too fast and you blow the vein. Too slow and the patient jerks away. I watched. I timed their routines. I noted the way Cameron's truck engine idled for exactly 40 seconds after he pulled into the garage, because he sat in the cab scrolling his phone before coming inside. I noted the way Brielle locked the front door behind her with the deadbolt and then checked the knob twice, a habit that told me she was afraid of something, maybe creditors, maybe the truth. I noted the day the shredder ran for 11 minutes straight, longer than any normal household shredding, and the smell of hot motor oil from the machine working through a thick stack of paper. I noted the nights Cameron came home with his expensive shirt untucked and his collar sweaty, and the way he poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon before he even said hello. The garbage disposal jammed on a Sunday, and that accident gave me my first real piece of leverage. Cameron stood over the sink, jabbing it with a wooden spoon, while Brielle looked up plumbers on her phone and complained about the service fee. I walked over, unplugged the unit from the under-sink outlet, reached into the trap with a pair of long forceps I had carried in my old phlebotomy kit for 30 years, and pulled out a broken wineglass stem. And I did not flinch, even when the little shard nicked my finger and a bead of blood welled up because I have seen worse. Then I reset the overload button with my thumb. It ran perfectly. Cameron stared at me like I had performed open-heart surgery with a butter knife. Brielle said, "How did you know how to do that?" I looked at her and said, "I know how to fix things." That was the first time I saw them as fragile, not powerful. They were helpless in their own kitchen, drowning in a $200 plumber bill, while I had just solved their problem with a pair of forceps and a calm hand. I also noticed the way Cameron's eyes flicked to the locked office door after I fixed the disposal, as if my competence reminded him that I was not as stupid as he hoped. That incident gave me a reason to be in the kitchen, near the back hall, where Cameron kept a locked office. I started watching the door. I timed the hours when Cameron was out, which was often, because he liked to drive the King Ranch to the golf club and sit in the bar with other men who wore loafers without socks. I watched the lock. It was a quickset, a cheap residential deadbolt, the same kind Harlan and I had on the milk house. Harlan taught me to pick that lock one winter when we lost the key and a frost threatened the does. He called it a tension wrench and a rake. He said, "You need 3 things to pick a lock: patience, tension, and the knowledge that you are not in a hurry." I still had the little leather case in my coat because I had used it to open medical lockboxes during storm shifts when the key went missing and a nurse needed a crash cart unlocked. I waited until they left for a country club dinner, which Cameron announced with the enthusiasm of a man going to a coronation. Then I knelt at that office door, inserted the tension wrench, and raked the pins. It took 3 minutes, but it felt like an hour because my knees ached and my heart was beating hard enough to count. I slowed my breathing, using the same technique I used with panicking patients: slow in through the nose, hold out through pursed lips. The door clicked open. The office smelled like toner and tequila. There was a shredder overflowing with confetti, and a desk with 3 monitors, and a filing cabinet in the corner that was supposed to be hidden behind a potted ficus. I sat on the floor and pieced together a few strips of shredded paper, like a phlebotomist reading a blood smear under a microscope. The words dissolution, bill of sale, and notary public came together in a pattern that made my stomach drop. Then I found the filing cabinet. The top drawer was locked, but that lock was even cheaper, a little wafer lock that yielded to my tension wrench in under a minute. Inside was a folder labeled Bell Meadow Transaction. It held a document titled Certificate of Dissolution, signed with my name, dated 2 weeks before. My signature looked close, but the M in my last name leaned the wrong way. I have written that M 10,000 times on lab requisitions and shift logs. It leans left, always has, because I am left-handed and the downstroke always catches. This M leaned right, like someone had copied it from a photo and overcorrected. The notary stamp was a photocopy, flat and gray. The real one from Harlan's original was embossed, raised like a braille letter. Under that was a loan application from a hard money lender called Meridian Capital, secured by the dairy's herd and equipment. The borrower was Bell Meadow Dairy LLC, and the guarantor signature was mine. I had never seen the document. The loan amount was $240,000, and the stated purpose was bridge financing for a regional dairy cooperative acquisition. The interest rate was 19%, with a personal guarantee clause that would strip my pension and Harlan's life insurance if defaulted. I read that clause 3 times, and each time I felt a cold wave move through my chest. This was not just theft. This was a setup. They were planning to saddle me with a predatory loan, default on it, and let the lender come after everything I had ever earned. I photographed every page with my phone, put everything back in reverse order, and relocked the cabinets. Then I sat in the dark office for a long time, listening to the central air kick on, and I felt something shift in me. The grief was still there, but under it was a colder, more precise thing. I was not just a widow. I was the woman who found the vein. Over the next week, I went back into that office 4 more times, always at night, always when they were out at the club or asleep upstairs. I learned the house's rhythms, the creak of the 3rd stair, the way the security system chirped when a door opened. I learned that Cameron kept his important papers in the filing cabinet, but his important emails on the desktop, which had a password I guessed on the 2nd try, because it was the name of his boat, which was written on a bumper sticker on the back of the King Ranch. The first time I tried the password, I used the boat name with a capital letter and the numbers 123 and got locked out for 15 minutes. The second time I tried the boat name with the year he bought the truck, 2023, and it worked. I logged into his email and found the cooperative's offer letter for $590,000, with line items for the herd, the aging room equipment, the cheese recipes, and the name and contact information of a title agent. I found a forged letter from me to the cooperative saying I had voluntarily withdrawn from the business and had no further claim to the assets. I found a cashier's check stub for $4,100 with the memo line whey. That check was mailed to me at their house. Betrayal called it a dividend. I called it a confession. I found the escrow account number, the wire instructions, and a notary's name and commission number that belonged to a woman who had died 2 years before the date on the stamp. I found everything except one thing. I could not find the original agreement because it was hidden in my coat, folded against my ribs, and every time I reached into the lining to feel the embossed seal, I thought of Harlan's hands carving that hollow core, and the note, and the 11 ounces. The next afternoon, I drove myself to the credit union where Harlan and I had opened the business account. They thought I was at a grief support group. I had learned that they did not check on me between the hours of 1 and 4, because that was Brielle's spin class and Cameron's tea time. I wore a navy blazer and a silk scarf because I wanted to look like a woman in control, even if I had not slept in 2 days. I asked to see a compliance officer. Her name was Ruth Aucaffer, and she wore a navy blazer with a small pin shaped like a balance scale. She took me into a glass-walled office and listened without interrupting. She had a notepad and a pen, and she did not look at her watch once. She asked me to start at the beginning, and I did, from the day of the funeral to the night I picked the lock on Cameron's office. When I placed the original notarized agreement on her desk, she put on her reading glasses and ran her thumb over the embossed seal. She said, "This is the only original I have seen with a raised seal. The one on file with the cooperative's title company is a flat photocopy. Then she pulled up the account on her computer and pointed at something I had never noticed. Harlan had added a verification instruction to the operating agreement, a dead man's switch. It said any sale, dissolution, or transfer of assets over $50,000 required the physical presence of the majority owner and the original wet ink notarized agreement at this exact branch. Without that, the funds from the cooperative would sit in a blocked escrow account forever. No password, no power of attorney, no photocopied signature would release them. The funds would simply wait. I stared at the screen. Harlan had known. He had known before the aneurysm, before the forged dissolution, before the vultures. He built the hollow follower and hid the original notarized agreement because he understood that paper can be copied, but a raised seal and a widow's steady hand cannot. He left me a warning and a weapon. I felt the tears come then, not for grief but for gratitude, and I let them fall for about 10 seconds before I wiped my face and asked Ruth what came next. She gave me a small USB drive with a keystroke logger and told me to plug it into Cameron's desktop for 1 hour. She said, "Do not handle it more than necessary. Wear gloves." She said the credit union's fraud department had already flagged the Meridian Capital loan because the notary commission number belonged to a woman who died in 2019. She said the hard money lender had not yet funded the loan, but the application was moving through underwriting, and the closing was scheduled for the following week. She said if I could get Cameron to email the final bill of sale from his own account or present the forged dissolution at a closing, they could freeze everything and refer the case to the state attorney general. I told her I would do it. Then she looked at me with a steady brown gaze and said, "You know this is a crime they committed against you, not a family disagreement." I said, "I know." And I walked out of that credit union with the USB drive in my coat pocket and a feeling like I had just drawn a clean tube from a difficult vein. The house was empty when I got back, so I walked through the kitchen and looked at the whiteboard by the back door, where Brielle had written a list of things she wanted from the dairy's accounts. New milking stanchions, she had written with a little smiley face. A cheese cave dehumidifier. A brand new website with e-commerce integration. The list was long and full of things that cost money, and at the bottom she had written, in careful capital letters, "Sell the herd." That was the first time I fully understood the scale of what they were doing. They were not just stealing the business. They were dismantling it, selling it off piece by piece, and they were doing it with documents that had my name on them. They were going to leave me holding a defaulted loan and a dissolved company, and they were going to walk away with the money. I stood there for a long time, looking at that whiteboard, and I noticed a small smear of blue marker on her thumb where she had pressed too hard, as if the idea of selling the goats brought her physical pleasure. That whiteboard was her confession, written in her own hand, not even locked up. I took a photo of it with my phone. I did not know if I would need it, but I knew a phlebotomist documents everything. 2 days later, I staged a medical scare. I had learned to slow my breath and drop my pulse as a phlebotomist, not for lies, but to calm panicking patients before a difficult draw. I practiced in the basement room for an hour, sitting on the bed, counting my breaths down to 4 per minute, slowing my heart with an old vagal maneuver I learned from a cardiology nurse. You bear down like you are trying to empty your bowels, but you do not actually do it. You just strain a little, and the vagus nerve fires and your heart rate dips. I practiced until I could drop from 72 beats per minute to 54 in under a minute, and I made sure my face went pale by holding my breath for 30 seconds. Then I waited until Brielle and Cameron were both in the living room, watching something on the big television, and I walked to the center of the floor. I clutched my chest. I made a sound, a small guttural sound like an animal in a trap. Then I collapsed. I made my eyes roll back. I let my body go heavy, my head hitting the hardwood with a sound I knew would bruise, a dull crack that echoed in the high ceiling. For a long moment, nothing happened. The television played on. I heard a laugh track, a commercial jingle. Then I heard Cameron say, "Is that the FedEx envelope?" I opened one eye a slit, just enough to see through my lashes. Brielle stepped over my legs, not around me, over me, and grabbed a white envelope from the console table. She said, "The closing documents." Finally. Cameron stepped over my left arm, his loafer coming within an inch of my wrist. The sole of his shoe left a faint print of dust on the hardwood next to my hand. They stood 6 inches from my face and tore open the envelope. I lay there for 4 minutes while they read the paper. My own niece did not check my breathing. My own niece did not call 911. She did not put a hand on my chest or say my name. She said, "We need the old bat conscious for the notary on Monday." I lay on the floor with a bruise forming on my left temple and the smell of their expensive cologne and bourbon in the air, and I felt something die in my chest, not my heart, but the part of me that had ever believed family meant anything. That was the exact moment I stopped being her aunt. That was the point of no return. Any residual family loyalty I felt was extinguished in the space between her stepping over my body and the sound of the envelope opening. After they left the room, I waited another 90 seconds, then I stood up, brushed the dust from my slacks, and went back to the basement. I did not cry. I sat on the bed and practiced my breathing again because I knew I would need that calm on Monday. I plugged the USB drive into Cameron's desktop later that night. After the country club dinner, they forgot I was not invited to. I sat in the dark office for 1 hour, watched the little green light blink on the USB drive, and then I removed it with a gloved hand and put it back in my coat. The next day, I returned it to Ruth in a padded envelope addressed to the credit union's fraud department. Inside, I included a note that said, "The bait is set. They plan to bring me to your branch on Monday." I did not sign the note. I did not need to. Monday morning, Betrayal told me we were going to the credit union to sign a routine beneficiary update. She helped me into the back seat of Cameron's truck, and I kept the original agreement tucked inside my coat, folded against my ribs, the embossed seal a small hard pressure over my heart. The truck smelled like new leather and air freshener, and Cameron drove with one hand on the wheel, the other on his phone, his jaw set in a line that looked like a man about to close a deal. Betrayal sat in the passenger seat and turned around to smile at me every few minutes, her teeth very white, her eyes scanning my face for any sign that I might bolt. I smiled back, a soft, foggy smile, and I let my hand rest on the door handle like I was nervous. I was not nervous. I was counting the turns, the stoplights, the exact moment we would pull into the credit union parking lot. When we arrived, Ruth was at the front desk with 2 men in suits. One was a federal investigator with the state attorney general's office. The other was a sheriff's detective with a badge on his belt. Cameron carried a black leather portfolio. Betrayal held my elbow like a helpful caretaker. We walked to a conference room. The cooperative's title agent was there, a nervous young woman with a laptop and a stack of papers. They believed they were closing the $590,000 sale of Bell Meadow Dairy. Cameron slid a stack of papers across the table. He said, "Auntie, just sign at the tabs." His voice was smooth and practiced, like a man who had closed 100 mortgages. I looked down. The first tab was a dissolution and release of interest. The second was a bill of sale. The third was a personal guarantee for a Meridian Capital loan I never authorized. The fourth was a transfer authorization. The fifth was a tax indemnity. The pages were crisp, printed on high-quality bond, with sticky note flags in colors that reminded me of the tab's nurse's use on a patient chart. I picked up the pen. I held it over the paper. I looked at the M in my forged signature, leaning the wrong way, and I thought about all the mornings I had written that same M on lab requisitions. Then I set the pen down. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my coat and drew out the original agreement. The room went quiet. The title agent looked at it and said, "Is that an original?" Ruth took it from me gently and held it up. The embossed notary seal caught the light, and I saw Cameron's face change, the way a man's face changes when he realizes the locked door was never locked at all. Betrayal made a small sound, a high, thin whimper, like a goat separated from the herd. I did not say anything for a long moment. I simply laid the paper on the table, smoothing it flat with the side of my hand, the way I used to smooth a patient's skin before a draw. Then I said, "I have spent my life finding veins in hard times, but I will not bleed for people who step over my body." Betrayal hissed, "Sign it, you old fool." Her face was close to mine, and I could smell the expensive coffee on her breath, the faint trace of mint lip balm. She reached for the paper, but Ruth had already pressed a button under the table. The lights in the conference room brightened. The title agent's computer screen flashed a fraud hold notice. The sheriff's detective stood up and said, "Hands on the table." Cameron reached for the portfolio, but the federal investigator was faster, pinning the folder with his palm. The forged dissolution, with its photocopied notary stamp, was in the folder. Ruth opened my original agreement and held it under the UV light. The embossed seal glowed with the credit union's watermark, a faint blue pattern that only showed under ultraviolet. She said, "This is the only original. The sale is void." Then the investigator read Cameron his rights, and the detective turned to Betrayal and said, "You can walk, or we can walk you." She chose to walk, but her face had gone the color of spoiled whey, and she stumbled once on the carpet, and I did not reach out to steady her. I sat still in my chair, my hands folded on the table, and I felt the weight of the original agreement against my ribs, the hollow core finally full. I watched them lead Cameron out in handcuffs, his loafers scuffing the tile, his face pale under the fluorescent light. Betrayal walked out with a uniformed officer at her elbow, not handcuffed yet, but her eyes were wide and blank. The title agent packed up her laptop with shaking hands. Ruth sat down next to me and put a cup of water in front of me. She said, "It is over." I drank the water, and it tasted like something I had been thirsty for since October. Betrayal and Cameron were charged with forgery, bank fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. Cameron took a plea deal and got 42 months in a state facility. Betrayal took a plea deal and got probation plus 600 hours of community restitution. The Meridian loan was voided. The cooperative rescinded the sale. The court froze their accounts, seized the King Ranch F-350, and returned the $4,100 they had mailed me. Because Betrayal's fraud forfeited her 45% under the moral turpitude clause in the original partnership agreement, I became sole owner of the dairy. I renamed it Curd of Deceit Creamery. Betrayal shows up 3 days a week to scrub cheese molds. Her canvas coveralls are printed with the words "Cultured My Trust." Every label on every wheel of Chever and Aged Tom prints her fraud docket number, no extra charge. Some people say that is cruel. I say it is honest advertising. The first time she walked into the creamery wearing those coveralls, she looked at me with eyes full of hate and shame, and I looked back with the calm I had learned in the hospital. The calm you use when a patient has just insulted you, and you still have to find their vein. I told her where the brushes were, how to mix the sanitizer, the temperature the whey had to be before it went down the drain. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The first thing I did with the blocked escrow was pay off the dairy's feed loan and fund a year of cheese wheels for the church. The rest went into a trust for the does, which means the goats will have good hay and clean bedding for the rest of their lives, and the cheese will keep coming. The aging room smells like oak and brine and the specific sweetness of Toggenburg milk, and every time I walk through it, I think of Harlan's hands on the maple, sanding the follower, hollowing out the core, hiding the truth for me to find. He had known. He had known before the aneurysm, before the forged dissolution, before the vultures. He built the hollow follower and hid the original notarized agreement because he understood that paper can be copied, but a raised seal and a widow's steady hand cannot. He left me a warning and a weapon. I used both. And I use them still, every time I pull a wheel from the press and check the weight, every time I see Betrayal scrubbing a mold in silence, every time I print a label with that docket number. Last Christmas, the church gave out 64 wheels of our aged Chever, and the pastor said a prayer over each basket. I did not go. I stayed in the creamery and packed the last of the orders, because that is what Harlan would have done. When I finished, I took the wooden follower from the press and held it in my hands, feeling the balance, the 11 ounces of truth. I put it back in place, and I went home to the little house by the barn, where the goats were waiting. Family is a verb, not a noun. It means showing up, not signing over. And when someone steps over your body to grab a check, they have stopped being family. Integrity is not a blood type. You do not inherit it, and you cannot transfuse it into someone who lacks it. You can only set boundaries and let the clodding do its work. Some people think I should have felt sorry for Betrayal. I do not. I felt sorry for the little girl she used to be, the one who used to help me feed the goats and who laughed when the kids tried to jump on her back. But that little girl grew up and tried to bury me alive, and you do not owe your future to someone who practices your obituary. You owe it to yourself to stand up, to keep the original, to let the notary stamp glow under the light. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Tell me in the comments below. And if you believe in boundaries, in the power of a notarized original, and in cheese labels that tell the truth, hit like and subscribe. Stay sharp and keep your hands steady. I will see you in the next story.